All right, so you ever notice how on those crime shows, DNA evidence is like the be-all and end-all? Like, we got him.
Oh, absolutely. It's always so cut and dry on TV, isn't it?
Yeah, but is it really that simple? We're actually diving into that today, looking at the potential pitfalls of DNA evidence. A listener wrote in, really intrigued by this article, The Trouble with DNA Evidence. It's by Zak Martin, who's, well, he's kind of a big deal in the profiling world, worked with law enforcement all over.
Oh, I know Zak Martin's work. He's incredibly insightful. And it's true, for a while there, juries were hesitant about DNA evidence, weren't they? Trying to wrap their heads around the science, all those statistics.
Right. It wasn't that long ago. It was brand new. Now it's like, boom, DNA, case closed. But Martin argues, maybe not so fast.
It is interesting, though, isn't it, how it went from being viewed with skepticism to this gold standard.
Totally. And you know what? Martin actually says that early skepticism, it wasn't entirely unfounded. I mean, yes, some of it was just getting a handle on the science, but some jurors wanted more concrete proof, didn't want to hang a verdict on just numbers.
Absolutely. He actually uses the O.J. Simpson trial as a prime example of that. I mean, think about it. There was a lot of DNA evidence pointing to Simpson, but the jury still acquitted him. And a lot of those jurors later said they were worried about, police misconduct, right? The possibility of tampering. So that DNA as a silver bullet idea, out the window.
Makes you think, right? Even with something as supposedly definitive as DNA, there are still all these other factors at play, like who's handling it? What are their motivations? But even beyond that, Martin gets into something even more fundamental. DNA, unlike fingerprints, it can be transferred. Just because it's there doesn't mean you left it there.
It's true. Think about it. If you found a business card at a crime scene, you wouldn't automatically assume that person was guilty, right? They could have been there earlier. Someone else could have dropped it.
A million possibilities, yeah.
Exactly. That's Martin's whole point. He says if fingerprint evidence was treated the same way as DNA evidence, every case would get thrown out. He says this easy transferability, it's a huge vulnerability, especially with something like DNA. We're shedding cells constantly, leaving traces everywhere we go. To a doorknob, a stray hair falls out, even the tools investigators use. It all creates opportunities for innocent people's DNA to end up at a crime scene.
Okay, now I'm just picturing these crime scene investigators shedding like cats with every move they make.
Right.
But seriously, if it's that easy for DNA to end up in the wrong place, what's stopping someone from planting it there on purpose?
Well, that is one of the unsettling things that Martin brings up. He actually uses the case of Dr. Jan Falkowski, a psychiatrist who was falsely accused of rape using a stolen condom, to illustrate how surprisingly easy it can be to plant DNA evidence. It doesn't necessarily require some big, elaborate scheme or fancy lab work.
See, that's what I find so disturbing about it. You think, planting DNA, that's something only a criminal mastermind would do, but this case really shows that's not always true.
Not at all. And you know what makes this even more concerning? When you consider the potential for, let's just say it, police misconduct. This is something else Martin talks about. What happens when investigators are convinced someone's guilty, but they just can't quite prove it? That pressure to secure a conviction, even if it means planting DNA evidence, that's a massive ethical breach. But it happens.
It's a chilling thought. It really is. And it does make you wonder, if planting DNA is a possibility, how often does it actually happen? Did Martin get into any of that?
It's hard to say, honestly.
Yeah.
Proving that kind of thing, intentional planting, super difficult. But he does point out something kind of crazy around her. Apparently, over 90% of convictions based on DNA. It involved the accused denying something that the DNA later proved. Makes you think about those interrogations, right?
Wow, 90%. That's a lot higher than I would have thought.
Right. Like how much pressure are people under? Do they have good lawyers right away? It's kind of a scary thought.
Yeah.
But even putting aside, the intentional stuff, what about just plain old human error? Martin talks about that too, like accidental contamination.
Oh, right. Because even with the best intentions, things can still get messed up.
Totally. He brings up the Amanda Knox case. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So initially, it seemed like the DNA evidence was pointing right at her. But then her lawyers, they really started digging into how all that evidence was handled. And they argued that, there might have been contamination, either at the crime scene itself or maybe even in the lab. And they were able to successfully argue that that might have been what led to those DNA traces. And ultimately, her conviction was overturned.
Yeah, that's a really good example because it was such a high-profile case, and the fact that it was overturned based on, contamination concerns, it really makes you think twice.
It really highlights how important those protocols are, the safeguards they have in place. And those safeguards, They're even more crucial now because DNA testing has gotten so sensitive. We're talking tiny microscopic samples these days, which, I mean, it's amazing what they can do with so little, but it also means the tiniest thing can throw the whole thing off.
Right. Like the smaller the sample, the bigger the chance for error. It's like you'd need a completely sterile environment. And even then.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to something that, well, it really freaked me out when I read Martin's article, DNA Fabrication.
Wait, hold on. Are we talking about like creating DNA from scratch? Is that even possible? I thought that was still sci-fi stuff.
Not completely from scratch, but Martin talks about this researcher, Dr. Dan Frumkin. He was actually able to replicate DNA, like make copies, basically. And he did it using publicly available profiles.
Wait, so you're telling me that with enough knowledge, someone could just manufacture fake DNA evidence? How?
It's super complicated, but yeah, he proved it's possible. And when his research came out, it sent shockwaves through, well, the whole forensics world, basically. A lot of people tried to brush it off at first, like, oh, that's way too complicated for your average criminal to pull off. But, I mean, come on.
Yeah, criminals find workarounds for everything. Like, look at identity theft, counterfeiting. If there's a will and a big enough payoff, there's usually a way.
Exactly. Martin's point is that we can't just ignore the possibility of DNA fabrication, even though it's a relatively new thing. Especially when you think about what some criminals will do to stay out of jail or to frame someone else. He actually uses this case to illustrate his point, and it's wild. It sounds made up, honestly.
Okay, now I have to know. What's the case?
Do you ever hear of Dr. John Schneeberger?
Schneeberger? No, doesn't ring a bell.
So this guy, he was accused of assaulting a patient, drugging and raping her. And he denied it, of course, really vehemently. He even agreed to give a blood sample for DNA testing, totally voluntarily, or so it seemed. And those tests, they came back negative. No match.
So case closed, right? DNA says he's innocent, except obviously not.
Oh, it gets so much crazier. Years later, this guy's stepdaughter accuses him of assaulting her, too. Multiple times. So this time, when they do DNA testing, they take samples from all over. Blood, cheek swab, hair follicle, the works. And guess what? This time, all of them match the original rape case.
Hold on. How? Did he have an accomplice or something? Was it a lab mix-up? How did he beat the system the first time?
Okay, are you ready for this? Remember how I said this case was like straight out of a movie? This guy, Schneeberger, he had surgically implanted this device in his arm. And it was filled with another man's blood, plus some anticoagulants to keep it from clotting.
He had another guy's blood implanted in his arm.
Yes,
obviously.
Yeah. And they positioned it so that whenever they drew his blood, they were actually getting a sample from this other guy's DNA. It's insane.
Yeah, it's like brilliant and terrifying at the same time. And it actually worked multiple times.
And it did. It worked. They didn't catch on until years later. I mean, Schneeberger's case, it's a good reminder, you know. Criminals can be resourceful and determined. And we have to be just as smart, if not smarter. We can't just take DNA evidence at face value.
It's a good point. So after all this, where does Zak Martin land on the future of DNA evidence? Are we heading towards a world where it's just not a reliable tool anymore?
Well, he doesn't think it's useless. Not at all.
Uh-huh.
But he does say, you know, we can't just treat it like some kind of magic bullet. It's one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It's about the bigger picture, not just, aha, we found your DNA, case closed. Which, speaking of, it does feel like those crime shows, you know, they've really played up that whole DNA angle.
Oh, for sure. The CSI effect, right. It's also clean and straightforward on TV. But like we've been talking about, real life, way more complicated.
Totally. And it's not even just about the science itself. It's about everyone getting smarter, right? The investigators and the criminals.
Absolutely. Martin actually argues that a lot of those cold cases they solved with DNA years later, it worked because back then, people didn't realize what DNA could do. They weren't thinking about trace evidence the way they do now, where every little thing could be a clue.
So it's like the more we learn, the more criminals adapt. It's kind of a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, like Martin says, with DNA technology getting even more sensitive, more common, could it actually become less effective over time?
That's kind of a chilling thought. Like, will it get to the point where it creates more doubt than answers?
It's definitely something to think about. But I think the main takeaway, no matter what happens with the technology, is that context is key. You can't just look at DNA evidence in a vacuum. You got to look at everything else, too.
So our listener who wrote in, it sounds like the message isn't to completely disregard DNA evidence, but to understand that it's not the be-all, end-all. It's more complicated than that.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool, but it's not magic.
Well said. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive. It's been fascinating and a little unnerving to really dig into the complexities of DNA evidence.
Absolutely. It's one of those things you think you understand, but then you really start to peel back the layers.
Exactly. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, the truth is out there, but it might be hiding in plain sight.